How do you own hundreds of the world's most valuable properties, acquire $5 billion, and become close friends with kings, celebrities, and the world's biggest investment banks? You lie, you cheat, and you steal. Which is what Jho Low did. This is his story. In just 8 short years, this unassuming looking 22-year-old Malaysian man set in motion a chain of events which would lead to him becoming a billionaire, partying on a yacht with Paris Hilton and Leonardo DiCaprio and dating some of the most beautiful women in the world. It would also cause the erosion of political freedom for an entire nation, the rise of an authoritarian dictator, the suppression of free speech, and the murder of a prosecutor fighting against it. It's going to be a wild and a long story. But let's start at the beginning. Jho Low's story is a long and convoluted one, so I'd recommend getting comfy. It's also a story with a few moving parts which provide crucial context. Ready? Let's go. Jho Low's original name is Low Tech Jho, and he did not exactly grow up in poverty. His grandfather, Lo Meng Tak, made a small fortune in China in the distillery and iron mining industries before relocating the whole family to Malaysia. He relocated the family to avoid the rapidly developing Indo-China War and keep his family safe within the confines of the Malaysian border. Not too long after settling, Joe's father Low Hock Peng, or Larry Low as he's more commonly known, began the investments holdings company, MWE Holdings. It would be through his father and MWE that Joe would come to learn about the many uses of shell companies. While they escaped the danger of the Indo-Chinese War, what they didn't escape was the difficulties of being a Chinese national. Malaysia has a complicated history with Chinese immigrants and has repeatedly refused and suppressed equal rights for the Chinese people who live there. It was maybe these class and race differences which led to Joe's difficulties in school. While teachers said that he was a somewhat intelligent kid, he was not a popular one, and he was often picked on both for the way he looked and because of his Chinese heritage. The other kids would say that they would see him sitting alone when it came to lunchtimes or breaks, and that they felt sorry for him. Joe and family settled in Georgetown, which is one of Malaysia's wealthiest cities, and they were a somewhat wealthy family in that wealthy city. But being wealthy didn't change the class and racial issues which often plagued them, and many other Chinese immigrants too. It didn't matter how much money they had, they were always viewed as inferior because they were Chinese. Maybe this experience is what came to shape Joe's attitude towards Malaysia in future. Perhaps this is also why Joe was sent to the prestigious English private school, the Harrow Public Boarding School. If you're confused as to why a private school is called a public boarding school, then don't worry, you're not alone. In the UK, private schools are called public schools, and public schools are called state schools. Even I'm not really sure why. But if I was to hazard a guess, I imagine it would be some kind of technicality to get government funding or some sort of special tax exemption. Actually, I'm gonna Google it, because I'm curious now. This is exactly how I end up falling down so many rabbit holes. I wasn't far off. They pretend to be accessible for everyone so that they can get a tax exemption. What Joe quickly realised was that the class and racial inequalities he suffered in Malaysia weren't all that different in the UK. Even at a prestigious boarding school, people looked down on him because of his Chinese heritage, and they also looked down on him because his family could only measure their wealth with 6 zeros, while his classmates often came from families whose wealth can be measured in 9 zeros. You might then wonder why his father would send him to another school with largely the same problems again. Connections, baby. You see, while Harrow looks like a stuffy, wealthy Harry Potter school, it's actually a conveyor belt for the world's most powerful and wealthy. Previous attendees of Harrow were 3 British Prime Ministers, including Winston Churchill, the King of Jordan, 2 Kings of Iraq, 2 Qatari Sheikhs, 1 Indian Prime Minister, 4 Nobel Prize winners, Lord Byron, and a host of famous actors. To say this place was exclusive it's an understatement. It was during his time at Harrow that he would come to be close friends with a chap named Riza Aziz, who is the stepson of Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak. I'm not going to focus too much time on these two right now, but trust me when I tell you, they're coming back later. With his wealth not really matching his peers and his ethnicity being on the outside of the social norm, Jho started to learn that this was the club to be in, but he was going to need to impress the doorman to squeeze his way through the velvet ropes. So, he hatched his first scam to do so. He acquired some official letterheads from the Brunei royal family and used it to reserve tables at London's China White Club, a notorious hotspot for the rich and famous. He then told all of his classmates about it and invited them to relax in the VIP area that he'd reserved for a royal family who didn't even know they'd been invited. Jho and his friends partied the night away in an exclusive area of an exclusive club alongside celebrities and sports stars. While the scheme did gain him some attention and notoriety, it didn't fully gain their confidence because Jho wasn't like his classmates. His family didn't come from generational wealth. In the UK, class isn't something you can buy your way into. This is a very closed circle of people who have kept it that way for generations, and he just wasn't their class of person. He didn't have any credibility. Jho did learn a valuable lesson from the endeavour though. Prestige could open a lot of doors, even when that prestige was just a mirage. Another thing he'd learned while socialising with the children of wealthy Middle Eastern royalty was that the Middle East was a huge, untapped capital resource. It became obvious to Jho that in order to join this elite social circle, he would need to climb a few social ladders to gain some credibility. After spending some time contemplating his future, Jho accepted that he needed to go to a place which didn't have hundreds of years of social classism built into its historical hierarchy. A place where anything goes. A place where even a hapless chump can purchase credibility simply by waving a couple of $100 and shouting. He needed to go to the United States of America. Hi, if you're enjoying this video and you find it interesting, then please don't forget to press the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Additionally, you can also support the channel on Patreon for just $2 a month. Thanks very much, back to the video. Jho's father paid a rather expensive yearly tuition fees to slide Jho into Wharton Business School. Like Harrow, Wharton is a highly prestigious institution, but unlike Harrow, it isn't a conveyor belt for royalty and politicians, it's a conveyor belt for America's business brains, whose alumni includes Donald Trump, Warren Buffett, Google CEO Sundar Pichai, former Pepsi and Apple CEO John Sculley, and, well, to be honest, pretty much every CEO working in a Fortune 500 company. This would be how Jho would make himself seem more credible. If he could demonstrate that America's elite trusted him, then maybe that would be enough to persuade the elites in the Middle East they could trust him too. America is a unique place in many regards, but one of its more interesting facets is that it is genuinely easier to get ahead there by just being loud and attracting attention. Here in the UK, you'll never ever get to the top, unless you have a family history of being at the top. It's a society built on a millennia of class hierarchy that I'm not sure we will ever escape from. As an example of what I mean, just under half of our 55 modern day prime ministers all came from one school, Eton. And all the remaining prime ministers, apart from 5, came from other private schools. In Europe, you're generally expected to be reserved and quiet and polite if you're part of the elite, and brashness is seen as a characteristic of the working class, and showing it will mean that you stay in that class. However, in the USA, maybe because it doesn't have that millennia of classism, you can get to the tippy top by bullying your way there. That's not a slight against the culture of the USA. It genuinely means that anyone can achieve anything. It doesn't mean that you will, but you have a better chance. There's no 19th Earl of Winchesterbury who already owns all of the land and half of the houses upon which you need to build a life. The classism here is so dense and entrenched that when I said Earl of Winchesterbury, you probably didn't even realise that that person and place don't exist. And you just assume that it does because it sounds exactly like the kind of silly upper class British person and title who owns all the wealth and power in this country. I guess the point which I'm kind of pontificating myself towards is said much better by American poet Josh Billings. I hate to be a kicker, I always long for peace, but the wheel that does the squeaking is the one that gets the grease. And I bet you didn't know where that phrase came from, did you? Don't feel bad, neither did I until I researched this video. As soon as Joe rocked up at Wharton, he knew that his mission this time wasn't like at Harrow. At Harrow, he listened and paid attention in classes to get educated, but here in Wharton, he was here for one thing only: connections. Joe was a wheel that so far had rolled around quietly, but it was time to start squeaking. Only a few months into his first year at Wharton, he decided to spend $40,000 of his father's money to hire the nightclub Shampoo for the night. He knew it was an opportunity to make his mark, and so he sent out custom invitations to all the top sororities in the Philadelphia area. The idea being that if he could get all the hottest and wealthiest girls in Philadelphia to come, everyone else would follow. He made sure to emblazon the invitations with his name so everyone knew who would throw the party. Free bar, hot girls, and a sought-after DJ had the desired effect, and the place was packed. And suddenly, everyone was talking about him, with some even referring to him as a Malaysian prince, a title which he never corrected people about. He understood that exclusivity is a kind of currency, and by arranging an exclusive party filled with exclusive guests, he was corralling himself in with the Richie Riches of America, subconsciously speaking, and they would over time come to see him as one of themselves, because in America your class is determined by the dollars in your bank, and he had lots of them. Well, he tricked them into thinking he had lots of them anyway. After the party, people started to pay more attention to Joe, and he would pretend that he was a business guru and offer stock tips. Well, one of them was Enron, just 1 month before they filed for bankruptcy. He also arranged trips to Atlantic City to gamble in casinos. He even invited fellow Wharton student Ivanka Trump to one of his casino visits. Joe later told friends that she replied by saying that she would never enter one of her father's skeezy casinos. Whether that's true, who knows? It's easy to assume that Joe was lying, but one thing you'll come to learn about Joe is that he doesn't tell lies that make him sound worse. So I'm inclined to think that it's probably true. He was gaining in popularity and influence within Wharton and its young students, but he wasn't satisfied and continually dreamed of the oily dark riches still sitting out there in the baking desert of the Middle East. While on a summer break from Wharton, Joe decided to hightail it back to the Middle East to try and get his foot in the door with Middle Eastern royalty. He had somehow managed to wrangle himself a meeting with a man named Yusuf al-Otaiba, who was a government advisor to most of the sheikhs in the United Arab Emirates. Al-Otaiba, according to some people, had a talent for politics and diplomacy, but less so for business. So, when a 22-year-old Malaysian millionaire asked for a meeting to discuss investments in Malaysian business, he took it, not knowing that the 22-year-old millionaire was actually just a not yet graduated Wharton student, and also not a millionaire. Al-Otaiba sat with Joe while he asked a whole bunch of questions about the power and political structures of the United Arab Emirates. It's a tough word to say, and he politely educated him on how things work in his corner of the Middle East. Otaiba himself was an advisor to the Crown Prince of the UAE. He was about as well connected as it gets. What he wasn't, though, was obscenely wealthy like the people that he advised. Meeting Jho Low was an opportunity to potentially increase his wealth to match his peers and employers. At that time, Abu Dhabi hadn't yet become the beacon of opulence which it is today, but it was rapidly in the process of doing so. Thanks to rising oil prices, the Gulf state had an almost infinitely growing wealth, but it was just sitting there doing nothing. It was in this meeting with Al-Otaiba that Joe would first learn about sovereign wealth funds, an investment vehicle in which nations place trillions of dollars to be invested in a variety of different industries, with a view to increasing those trillions even further. Joe persuaded Al-Otaiba to arrange a meeting for him with the manager of Mubadala, one such sovereign wealth fund. That manager would be a man named Khaldoon Khalifa al-Mubarak. The name might not be familiar to people, and this face might not be familiar either, but if I swap this photo for this one, most people will suddenly realise who this is. It's the chairman of Manchester City Football Club. Back then, he hadn't yet become the city chairman, and Sheikh Mansour hadn't yet bought the club, but they were looking for opportunities for investment across the whole world, really. And he had $302 billion at his disposal. Low's meeting with al-Mubarak didn't last very long, but it did leave a lasting impression. Jho Low was now acutely aware of what he wanted to do. The introduction to sovereign wealth funds had planted a seed in his mind. Jho excitedly returned to Wharton to finish out his final year. At the same time, he opened a new corporation in the British Virgin Islands, which he called Winton. When his friends asked what the name meant, a deadpan Jho replied, "Win tons of money." Even they weren't really sure if he was kidding. The idea behind the company was to convince his new Middle Eastern acquaintances to invest money in Winton, which would then be used to invest in Malaysian business opportunities, and he'd take a broker's fee for doing so. The problem was that the corporation had no financial backing. Oftentimes, the hardest part of getting business investment is convincing that very first person to invest. Each investor is social proofing to the next investor, a technique which would be a staple of Jho's arsenal much later. There was no chance of his friends in the UAE investing until it already had some financial credibility first. In 2007, Najib Razak was the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, and he had an eye on the top job. The issue was that he had a few black marks against his name. There were rumours of him and his wife accepting kickbacks for big government contracts, and two of his personal security had been convicted of the murder of a woman who had been the girlfriend of one of Najib's right-hand men, which many people felt was at the behest of Najib. Said woman was about to turn prosecution witness in an investigation into government bribery involving that right-hand man and implicating Najib by association. The woman had been shot and then her corpse had been detonated with C4 explosives, so there was little doubt that it was a murder. Najib denied any involvement, but pretty much everyone had trouble believing it. Najib's father had actually been a prime minister a few decades earlier and had been the architect of the Malaysian new economic policy back in the 70s, which had led to massive economic growth. His father, Tun Razak, was a very popular political figure and strongly believed in wealth equality. One of the primary goals of the Malaysian new economic policy was to greatly reduce poverty, a goal which it achieved by dropping it from 52% of the population all the way down to 17% in just 20 years. Tun Razak was said to be quite a humble person, and when Najib was a boy and asked for a swimming pool to be installed in the prime ministerial home, his father said no, because a public servant shouldn't use his position for personal benefit. Najib had pretty much coasted by on his father's popularity most of the time, but that was beginning to wane thanks to the recent scandals, and so he needed something big to catapult himself into the Prime Minister's office and make everyone forget about the past. The Malaysians had their own sovereign wealth fund called Khazanah, which was looking for business partners for a massive construction project called Iskandar. The Khazanah fund was much smaller than other sovereign wealth funds, and so it needed help with capital. It was at this point that Najib's stepson Riza Aziz said that he knew someone who might be able to help. Told you would be back again. Aziz mentioned that his friend from boarding school, Jho Low, had contacts in the Middle East and could arrange a meeting. Low had set up his company, Winton, on the 70th floor in extremely extravagant high-tech offices that he paid for with bank loans that he couldn't really afford. But he had done so on the belief that in order to be successful, one must project an image of success. Low had also been generating business deals with Najib's brother Nizam for high-end properties near the towers, so Najib was somewhat familiar with Low, even though it was said that he didn't really like him. But Low agreed to contact Al Otaiba in Abu Dhabi and see if he could get al-Mubarak interested in the Iskandar project. Low knew that he was not very popular with Najib, and so he offered to allow him to take complete credit should the deal go ahead. It was a calculated move by Low for two reasons. Firstly, because it would bring him and Najib closer together, but also it would allow him to remain in the shadows. Not too long after, Low had brokered the deal between al-Mubarak and Najib, and the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund had agreed to invest about $500 million in the Iskandar construction project. Najib and his wife threw a celebration to mark the occasion, and it gave the public the impression that Najib's days of dodgy dealings were over, and now he was a legitimate player. As for Jho, but his game was just beginning. This part of the story might be a little difficult to follow, but try to stick with me. After the success of the Iskandar Deal, Jho had expected to get a broker's fee, but neither Mubadala nor its Malaysian counterpart Khazanah would agree to a broker fee because Low was only a middleman and he wasn't a licensed professional. They also didn't really want to officially connect their names to his. To make some money, he was going to need to own something. And this is where Jho remembered the murky world of shell companies in shady tax havens, which his dad had taught him. While he didn't get paid by the deal, he thought that if he looked for undervalued construction companies and bought them, he could bid on those juicy government Iskandar contracts, win them thanks to his new friend in the Prime Minister, and then sell the construction company onto someone who knew what they were doing for a much higher price. After poking around, he found two which were cheap enough to buy, and he set his plan in motion. Having no money himself and no bank willing to loan him the money thanks to his non-existent assets and track record, he created a shell company called the Abu Dhabi Malaysia Kuwaiti Investment Company to make it seem as though all three sovereign wealth funds were backing his company. He then issued a bunch of shares and he gave them away for free to people like Al Otaiba, a few other people connected in Kuwait, and he also gave one to one of Malaysia's sultans. And this meant that when someone checked the company of record, it would have the impression that a whole bunch of very connected Middle Eastern wealthy royalty were shareholders in this company, and it would make it seem like it was backed by big money. He then went to various banks to acquire loans, and now that it looked like the company already had very wealthy investors, those banks were happy to issue those loans. It was kind of brilliant in its simplicity, really. But Jho didn't stop there. He also took out some more loans against the company, which he used to buy a stake in the Iskandar project, which made him an investor as well. He then set up two more companies, this time in the Seychelles. He specifically chose there to take advantage of a financial instrument which was banned in pretty much everywhere else, something called bearer shares, which are essentially just bits of paper which signify the person holding that bit of paper owns the company. If I had bearer shares right now and I passed them to you, you would be the owner of that company. No processing, no applications, and no paperwork. For obvious reasons, this makes it impossible to track who the owners of these companies are, which is exactly why Jho chose them. He called these two companies ADIA Investment Corporation and KIA Investment Corporation, which just so happened to be extremely similar names to the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and the Kuwaiti Investment Authority. I feel like it should be obvious at this point why he did this, but just to be sure, naming them something so similar and having them set up as unregistered bearer share companies meant if anyone did bother to check the company records, they wouldn't be able to tell who owned it, and would probably just assume that they were subsidiaries of the properly named ones, because, well, why would you go through the trouble and expense of doing all this if they weren't official subsidiaries? He had set up his shell game. Now he just needed a second player. What Jho needed was a wealthy person to whom he could sell this collection of companies, which was about half made up of shell companies, but did actually have government contracts, construction vehicles, and land. It wasn't an empty company, but it also wasn't even close to the value that he was going to sell it for once he found a suitable sucker. That sucker was this guy, Taib Mahmood, a wealthy but elderly businessman from Sarawak, who also happened to be the chief minister and looking for investment in his lands. Mahmood also had a history of being accused of government corruption. Low used the promise of potential Middle Eastern investment to convince him to buy the land and construction companies. Shortly after, Mahmood completed the purchase of these companies, netting Low a $110 million profit. And just like that, Jho Low had made himself wealthy and created himself a reputation as a mover and shaker in the business world without ever producing anything at all. It was the execution of this convoluted scheme which caught the eye of the most famous bank on Wall Street. Goldman Sachs is a Wall Street bank. I'm not going to get too deep into who they are and what they do because I don't really like giving positive promotion to psychopaths. But they're a big player. maybe the biggest player. They're also repeatedly involved in illegal shady stuff. Just their top 5 fines are over $10 billion and include things like price fixing, consumer protection violation. That's the polite way of saying that they fuck over their customers, like when they knowingly sold worthless mortgage bonds to customers and they themselves had bet against those mortgage bonds, which helped to create a financial crash. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that's legalese for bribing foreign governments. While they somehow have a really good reputation, the truth is, there's very little that's illegal that they won't engage in. I think the way them and most other banks look at this is if the fines that they'll pay are lower than the profits they'll make, then it's worth breaking the law. Goldman Sachs is where we find our next participant in the story. Tim Leissner was the head of Goldman's Asia division around this time. A German who had risen to the top inside Goldman Asia by using his connections to a Malaysian billionaire to take his companies public for about $800 million, making Goldman around $10 million in the process. However, he wasn't the squeaky clean rising star he seemed to be. There were accusations that he was sleeping with a female executive at those companies, which gave Goldman an unfair advantage when bidding to be the bank which helped those companies to go public. He would also promise that Goldman would underwrite a $1 billion deal with Maybank, except he hadn't been given authority or permission to make that offer on behalf of Goldman. He was happy to work outside the rules if it meant a big payday, which is probably why Goldman promoted him. The worldwide mortgage crisis had everyone screaming and business opportunities were limited as worldwide liquidity was very low at that time. Tim was looking for undervalued opportunities when he was introduced to a 26-year-old Malaysian businessman by local Goldman banker Roger Ng. This businessman claimed to have an amazing opportunity. In case you haven't guessed, that businessman was Jho Low, and he did indeed have an opportunity. An opportunity for a massive billion-dollar theft. You see, while Tim had been putting out financial fires all over the world due to the financial crisis, Jho had spent time with one of the sultans of Malaysia and made him a bit of money via the pseudo scam of Abu Dhabi Kuwaiti Malaysia Corporation he'd made before. He convinced the sultan to invest $1.6 billion into a sovereign wealth fund. The sultan was a conservative Muslim, and he was very concerned about giving such a huge amount of his oil wealth to a 26-year-old with no experience. To allay those fears, Jho told him that he had connections at Goldman Sachs who would help him manage the entire thing. He didn't, but by now Jho had developed an attitude of promise now, figure out how to do it later. The Sultan did agree to invest the money, but only after Goldman officially came on board. Jho wasn't going to be able to fake it this time. He actually needed Goldman to come aboard, but he doubted that his record would pass an American bank's vetting process. Investment banks had already rejected him twice before for accounts and loans, so he was going to need an inside man who wasn't averse to bending the rules to make shitloads of money, and $1.6 billion was a shitload of money. Bringing in Goldman would give the fund, and by extension him, international legitimacy. But who would be willing to put their career in jeopardy to do this? Enter Tim Leissner. Rather ironically, the two didn't like each other, each finding the other person to be an unreliable loose cannon, but both wanting what the other had. Leissner wanted to bring that wealth fund to Goldman and earn a fat commission, and Low wanted the Goldman name to legitimize what would soon be an enormous theft. Low arranged a meeting between Leissner and the Sultan, and a few short days later Goldman was officially on board. Initially the Sultan went ahead with the deal but quickly got cold feet after hearing rumours about Low and his shady practices. Low's dream was slowly crumbling. Luckily, an investment he made a few years earlier was about to pay off. While Low was running around trying to put together his shady wealth fund, a prime ministerial election was going on, and thanks to Low letting Najib Razak take all the credit for the massive construction project he arranged between Malaysia and Abu Dhabi, Razak had just become the Prime Minister of Malaysia and was now the most powerful man in the country. Low returned to Razak to congratulate him, hoping that Najib would remember just how much he had helped previously. He wasn't wrong. Najib knew to keep his seat at the next election he was going to need a war chest for both campaigning and to redevelop areas of Malaysia. Low convinced him that money would come in the form of Middle Eastern investment in their sovereign wealth fund. What sovereign wealth fund? Najib had asked him, and Low would reply, the one which I set up via the Sultan, which you are now going to take over as Prime Minister. Low convinced him that with the $1.5 billion already inside the fund, they could convince his friends in the Middle East to add to it. He also told him that with so much capital inside the fund, it could also borrow from international markets with much more favourable rates to raise even more money. The issue was that the $1.6 billion was sitting in an account back in Malaysia, and Low wanted it in accounts which he controlled and only he. But Razak wasn't just going to give the money away, he still didn't fully trust him. So Low arranged a meeting on a massive yacht with a Saudi prince who owned a company called Petro Saudi. Said prince agreed to contribute $2.5 billion of assets to the fund in the form of oil fields, which he controlled on the proviso the Malaysian fund would contribute cash. Now, if you've been following the story closely, you'll probably realise this was more smoke and mirrors. Now, the prince was genuinely a real Saudi prince, and he really did own Petro Saudi. However, it did not have the funds or assets anywhere close to that. In truth, the prince didn't really have massive assets at all, and as one of 20 children, he didn't expect to receive much of the family money either, and actually when his father passed away, he was expecting to get pushed away from power and finance. He wasn't providing assets, he needed them. But as with many of Jho Low's schemes, the name and appearance of wealth was the important part of the scam. This meeting with the Saudi prince and the perception that he had just increased the value of the wealth fund by another $2.5 billion convinced Najib to repackage the fund as 1MDB. 1MDB standing for One Malaysia Development Berhad, a fund specifically created to create better opportunities and to reduce inequalities for all people and ethnicities of Malaysia, hence the name One Malaysia. Jho got his wish, and the money previously held in a Malaysian bank account was transferred into the new sovereign wealth fund set up by Jho's friend Tim at Goldman Sachs. Najib now trusted Jho completely, and although he was not named as an executive or any type of employee for the fund, Najib made sure everyone knew that Jho was the head honcho. Jho then quickly arranged the transfer of $700 million to repay a loan acquired from Petro Saudi. The first thing bankers and the board of directors asked was, "What loan?" The $700 million loan was paid to a company called Goodstar, which Jho insisted was a smaller subsidiary of Petro Saudi. When people tried to check, it was impossible to determine who the owner of Goodstar was. People assumed it was because the prince was just not a very public guy. He was, and he didn't really like his business being public. He didn't. But a clue as to who the real owner of Goodstar was could be found when you looked at where the company was registered. The Seychelles. Goodstar was a bearer share registered corporation in the Seychelles, which made it impossible to tell who owned it. You should have already guessed who the owner was by now. Bingo. It was Jho. A transfer of $700 million had been arranged from the fund to a corporation controlled solely by Jho that had zero oversight from anyone else in the whole world. And you might wonder why the Prince of Saudi Arabia, Goldman Sachs and anyone else might not have said anything about the fact that 60% of the funds just disappeared. They were in on it. Jho immediately made payments to the Prince, Tim Leisner and anyone else who had helped him hide this. The whole process of setting up the fund and pushing through the transactions lasted only a few weeks, which was extremely strange, as normally financial instruments and transactions of this type and size took a year or more to set up. After Jho had finished paying everyone off, there was about $400 million left for him to play with. And that's exactly what he did. Las Vegas bills itself as the entertainment capital of the world, a city of lights, a city of excess, a city designed from the ground up to be one big party. What better place for Jho to celebrate his recent acquisition of wealth? On the casino floor of this ridiculously expensive looking Palazzo Hotel, sitting amongst a collection of Asian men playing cards, was Leonardo DiCaprio. What Leo was doing there was anybody's guess, but a more interesting question was, who was the slightly portly Chinese chap sitting next to him and chatting? Yep, it was Jho Low. Also in attendance were a collection of Playboy playmates who had been paid to be the evening's eye candy for Joe's extravagant party. He spent the night gambling and drinking with DiCaprio and a collection of beautiful models in one of the most luxurious hotels in Las Vegas. And by any average man's standards, that would be a sensational evening. But for Joe, it just wasn't enough. So over the next 8 months, after using a variety of financial instruments to sneak his money into US institutions, Joe threw party after party after party. He spent $100,000 a month renting apartments for him and his staff in New York. Whenever he went, an entourage of security staff went with him at a cost of tens of thousands of dollars. He ran up a $130,000 barbell in one night at a New York nightclub. He tipped staff hundreds of thousands of dollars. He rented expensive rare cars. He bought expensive watches and clothes. He once bought a few hundred Hermes handbags and just handed them out to people in the nightclub. While out partying one night, he spotted Lindsay Lohan celebrating her 21st birthday, so he did what any normal person does and sent over 21 bottles of Cristal at $500 a bottle. He rented private jets and private yachts. He paid Playboy models to party with him night after night after night. By the end of that 8-month period, Joe had spent $80 million just partying. Suddenly, everyone became aware of the mysterious Malaysian billionaire who threw money around like he didn't care about it. He was becoming infamous for his excess and generosity, which of course was the point. He wanted everyone to know that he was the most important guy in whatever room he decided to grace. Newspapers, magazines, and gossip columns could not stop their lips from flapping about this new megastar who was connected and spotted with some of the most famous people in Hollywood. He became friends with a pair of nightclub owners by dropping millions of dollars in their nightclubs. Joe knew the pair had a lot of celebrity patrons, and by becoming friends with them, he would be able to get closer to the celebrities as well. This helped to make sure the guest list at all his parties were the envy of everyone. His guests included DiCaprio, Tobey Maguire, Usher, Jamie Foxx, Kate Upton, Megan Fox, Emily Ratajkowski. It's a really, really long list. He was building a very carefully cultivated public perception. Strangely, despite being constantly surrounded by celebrities and Playboy centerfolds, nobody ever saw him flirting with any women or dating any. But that's only because he hadn't met the right one yet. Over the next couple of months, Low would invite celebrity socialite Paris Hilton to his many parties in an attempt to impress her and get her interested. She had been his dream girl since college. Eventually, he managed to talk his way into her 29th birthday party held in one of his favourite places, the Palazzo in Las Vegas. By this point, most people knew Joe as the Malaysian party king who threw his money around, but they didn't know where his wealth came from. Some people assumed he was royalty, and others whispered rumours of him being an arms dealer. On the casino floor of that hotel, in a private room, Joe surprised Paris with a Cartier watch and $250,000 in gambling chips as a birthday present. Unlike other men though, Joe didn't immediately push her for contact or try to get physical or try to chat her up. He just invited her to come and gamble with him, and she did, and watched as Joe lost over $2 million without even breaking a sweat. He gambled as if the money never ended, and that too was calculated by Joe, remembering that the only credibility anyone needs in the USA is wealth. So he tossed millions of dollars down the drain without flinching, knowing that it would impress his money-hungry celebrity guests. And it did. Back in Malaysia, however, people were seeing the press reports of Joe's antics and wondering what was going on. Chairman of the 1MDB fund, Najib Razak, while grateful that Joe had helped him win an election, had started to become curious. Joe realised that he couldn't just party forever or the money would run out, and so he would need to actually make the money work as well as play. He started buying up luxury properties in New York, Los Angeles and London. He also set up a $3 million account with a jeweller who was the favourite of Najib's wife, so that she could just go and pick out whatever jewelry she wanted. Joe was smart. Keeping Najib's wife happy was likely to keep him happy. happy wife, happy life. But just in case, he also created a separate account and filled it with millions of dollars of campaign funds for Najib, so that he could feel satisfied as well. Najib was the chairman of the 1MDB fund and held veto power over all the other board members, so as long as Joe kept him happy, he'd be able to continue using the fund as his own private fund without many questions. Since he was flying back and forth from various destinations now, he also decided to splash out $35 million on a private jet. By this point, Joe had spent and invested about $250 million of the $360 million, which he had kept from the initial transfer. And he did still also have about half of the money that he'd made from his first deal selling the construction companies. But what other ways could he invest that might give decent returns?
Thank you. First off, thank you to the Hollywood Foreign Press. I never would have guessed I would have won for Best Actor in a Comedy. So I'd like to pay some congratulations to my fellow comedians here tonight, Christian Bale, the great Joaquin Phoenix, Oscar Isaac. First and foremost, I have to thank Mr. Martin Scorsese. Thank you for allowing me to stalk you into making this movie. Thank you to the entire production team, Joey, Riz, Joey, Riz, and Joe. Thank you for being not only collaborators, but taking a risk on this movie.
Hold on a second. That guy looks kind of familiar. Isn't that... Yeah, it's Reza Aziz. Now, if you listen carefully, DiCaprio personally thanks Joey, that's this guy, Reza, which is our pal Reza Aziz, and Joe. The Joe that he's talking about is Jho Low. The Wolf of Wall Street's gross profits, depending on your sources, were around $400 million on a $100 million budget, making it a roaring success. A small independent studio was the production company behind The Wolf of Wall Street, called Red Granite Pictures. Let's rewind time a little bit back to 2007. Leo had just won a bidding war to the memoirs of the famous Wall Street swindler Jordan Belfort, hoping to turn it into a major Hollywood production. He showed it to Scorsese, who loved it and came on board immediately. The problem was, every time they showed it to a studio to get them interested, they'd get cold feet at the absolute debauchery being shown on screen, and would only finance the movie if those scenes were cut, or its $100 million budget was basically chopped right down to a couple of iPhones and a table lamp. They were terrified that they weren't going to get their money back. Let's jump back to 2010, where Reza Aziz and Jho Low would become friends with a chap called Joey McFarland, who was pretty well connected in Hollywood. And he suggested that if Joe wanted to get in with the Hollywood crowd and he didn't mind throwing a bit of money around, which he didn't, then starting a production company and financing their movies would be that way in. So, Reza and Joey founded Red Granite Pictures, and as usual, Joe's name would not be officially tied to the company at all. When Joe learned that DiCaprio had been trying to get a movie off the ground, he realised this was their opportunity, and he told Aziz and McFarlane to immediately finance the movie using the money from the 1MDB fund. Assuming the movie was a success, it would further legitimise Joe in the eyes of the business world, and it would also make those celebrities that he coveted so much want to be in his orbit for a change. In the summer of 2010, Joe drifted into the French Riviera on board a 300-foot super yacht. Lounging next to him on that yacht was Paris Hilton. As usual, Joe wanted to be the centre of attention, and it wasn't just the yacht and the socialite either. Later that evening, he attended a party, a pretty unique kind of party called a bottle parade. How do I explain it? Well, the way they work is rich people would give competing bids to spend the most money on champagne. The biggest bidder would win the honour of having his bid's value of champagne delivered to him by a collection of French models. No normal, sane person would engage in this practice, as it's an enormous waste of money. But that was the point, to show how much money you had by being as ostentatious as possible. On this particular bottle parade, Joe blew the competition out of the water, paying $2 million, which meant that the club had to serve $2 million worth of champagne to all the guests in the club. That's 4,000 bottles of champagne. It's absolutely absurd, and probably not even possible to do in one night. The rest of the night passed in a blur of alcohol, with Low and Hilton looking equal parts drunk and cosy as the night went on. And then the next day, they did it all over again. Gossip magazines and newspapers referred to Jho as Paris's boyfriend, but in reality that wasn't actually true. In truth, Jho already had a woman. Well, two actually. Jho had been enamored with a Taiwanese pop star and showered her with expensive jewelry, but even she wasn't his actual girlfriend. Back in Malaysia, Jho had a real girlfriend who sometimes flew out to the USA to spend time with him, but she was always kept away from the parties. He told her that all the women that she saw him with in public were all paid to be there as part of a public image, which was actually true. But she did eventually find out about the Taiwanese pop star. You might think that there was a big fight and she broke up with him and stormed back to Malaysia, but she just kind of accepted it. I guess that opulent lifestyle seduces everyone. Back in Malaysia, his reputation had spread far enough that his family were now seeing his outrageous exploits, and his father Larry was furious. And he called his son, demanding that he come home from work and work on his public profile instead. Najib had contacted him making pretty much the same request, so Jho returned home and spun a bullshit story for the local state-controlled newspaper, and then flew out again and checked himself into a $30,000 private rejuvenation clinic to recover. Holy shit, people pay $30,000 to rejuvenate? The fuck does that mean, rejuvenate? I'm like totally drunk all the time and I need to rejuvenate. I need like a juice cleanse. Fuck off. When he eventually came back to Malaysia again, it was the end of the financial year, and the 1MDB fund needed to post its accounts. The problem was that there was a $1 billion hole in the fund with no assets or investments to show for it. They did their best to fix the issue by pretending that the money they'd sent to Petro Saudi, the money that Jho had stolen, was actually a loan to Petro Saudi. For some reason, everyone seemed to totally forget that the reason for sending the money to Petro Saudi in the first place was to supposedly repay a loan to Petro Saudi. But like I said, nobody bothered to check on it. By booking this in the accounts as a loan, which wasn't due until 2020, they had effectively given themselves a reason for the money leaving the account, and it wouldn't need to be back in the account again until 2020. Their accountants, however, were not willing to sign off on it, since it looked an awful lot like someone trying to hide embezzlement. Because it was. So, they shopped around the big dogs, and KPMG agreed to come and do the accounts the way Low wanted, as long as they could prove the fund was backed by two nations. Which was easy, since Jho had been paying the prince for Saudi's involvement, and his campaign donations and extravagant gifts to Najib had resulted in an official letter of authority for Jho, even though he wasn't listed as an executive in any way. KPMG filed the accounts, and Jho figured he'd now have some time to fill the fund back up again with wise investments. In the summer of 2011, Jho flew the cast and crew of The Wolf of Wall Street to Cannes for a pre-production party, something which in itself is pretty unusual, since production companies generally don't like to spend extraneous money on movies that don't even exist yet. Jho's close relationship with DiCaprio had seen him agree $100 million to finance the movie. This was great for both DiCaprio and Scorsese, as Jho, Reza and Joey really didn't want to meddle in the movie to tone it down or anything else. They were happy to just let Leo and Marty run with it. This pre-production party in Cannes was all Jho's idea, as you probably guessed. One such guest would be the Wolf himself, Jordan Belfort, a man no stranger to shady business, having been convicted of securities fraud back in the 90s. For the people who were used to being around Jho, they had seen his mad spending before, so they just didn't question it. But Belfort took one look around at all the massive amounts of money being spent and immediately guessed that something wasn't right. Who spends $3 million on a pre-production party?
The reason I knew the money was stolen, or I thought there was something going on, was when I showed up for the launch party of The Wolf of Wall Street. This is before it was even filmed. I sold them the rights. They flew me to Cannes for a party to say they bought the rights. I walked into this party. They must have spent $10 million on the party. I looked at my dead wife and said, I promise you this is not going to end well. She's like, why? I'm like, no one would spend this much money unless there was something they were getting it without, doing the work for it. So I would really not fault Leo for this at all. I mean, like, he wouldn't know. He's an actor.
Jordan knew that the only kind of people who throw money around this recklessly were people who hadn't spilt the sweat and tears to earn it. Belfort, having already been to jail before and wanting to keep himself clean, decided to distance himself from the production and everyone involved. Belfort pulling away made Joe feel a bit insecure, so he offered Jordan 500 grand as an appearance fee to fly out to Vegas with the crew. To his credit, Jordan turned it down. How about that? A swindler turned down money from a swindler. Who would have thought?
A fisherman always sees another fisherman from afar.
Jordan would eventually be proven right, but even he had no idea of the massive scale of the scam. Joe wasn't content with just dipping his toes into the film industry and wanted to be a music mogul as well, so he set up a music production company called Red Spring, with the hope of luring big stars to his label. He threw a massive party and invited music industry giants like Jay-Z, Eminem, Pharrell, Lady Gaga. He even managed to make a record with Lil Jon where he himself sang on the track. His part was extremely small, just repeating the words "very hot" a couple of times. I tried to find it so we could have a listen and a laugh, but it was never publicly released, and sadly I think it's just lost to time now. With the funds running low in 1MDB, Joe persuaded Najib to send another $800 million of taxpayer money into the fund for investing. At this point, Joe had been siphoning money from the fund on a regular basis to keep donating to Najib's re-election campaign. As is often the case with people receiving vast sums of money, Najib never asked where the money came from and decided to tell himself that it was actually profits from 1MDB investments, just like Joe had told him. Joe suddenly had a big war chest again. This time, he realized he needed to invest the majority of it and find ways to immediately grow it, hence his sudden interest in music production. The added injection of cash meant that Joe had collectively had control of just under $2 billion at this point. But Low realized that a second option to fill up the fund was to simply find other investors to pump money into it. He had crossed paths with another wealth fund named International Petroleum Investment Company, or IPIC for short, another Abu Dhabi fund which had $70 billion at its disposal. He had been bidding against the fund for control of a collection of hotels, which included some very high-priced luxury hotels in London, when they decided to become partners instead. To convince them, Joe had signed a $50 million check on the spot as an initial investment. That deal didn't actually materialise, but it had convinced the manager of that fund, a man named Mohammed Al-Husseini, that Joe and his fund were legit. By this point, they definitely weren't, but he was actually trying to be. He convinced his new friend to invest in a Mongolian coal mine with him, hoping to flip it quickly and put money back into 1MDB. But just months after buying it, coal prices crashed as China's economy crashed with it. He also brokered a deal for IPIC to buy a Malaysian bank for almost $3 billion. The bank immediately had a stock plummet, losing IPIC hundreds of millions. It turns out Joe is not really that good at making legitimate money. Who knew? Joe was going to have to make it up to his new business partner. It was around this time that Petro-Saudi employee called Xavier Justo had felt shortchanged by his employers after setting up the only legitimate business 1MDB had, which was the purchase of 2 oil drilling ships, which were then leased to the government of Venezuela. Justo had footed the bill for operations for a couple of years until the money came through from 1MDB and Petro-Saudi. Surprise, surprise, it never did. So he chased his boss around for a while trying to get his money, and then decided to quit and agree in a severance package, which was basically just him getting back the money that he'd spent without any profit. And that probably would have been the end of it, if his former employer hadn't then reduced the severance pay and badmouthed him all around Europe. That mistake was going to be extremely costly. But don't worry, we'll get there soon enough. Now you might be thinking that with all of this massive fraud flying around that maybe there's just no regulation or oversight when it comes to high-level banking. But that would be wrong. Thanks to numerous financial crashes and the Panama Papers thing and a massive list of different crimes and schemes and scams, there were lots of rules and laws about moving large sums of money, and after 9/11 the USA in particular had pushed through regulations about banking and anonymous movement of funds via the Patriot Act. There were multiple checks and balances throughout the system in pretty much every country that Joe was spending money in. The problem, as it always is, was that the people supposed to be enforcing these checks and balances were making so much money that they often just looked the other way or failed to properly investigate all the money that was moving around via Joe's secret funds. They would see a national wealth fund sending huge amounts of money to a tiny private account in the Seychelles and think, that looks kind of suspicious, and then they'd see the massive broker fees and suddenly it wasn't suspicious anymore. Joe knew that he could rely on people being greedy. He was a shit businessman, as should be obvious by now, but he did know how to read and motivate people. Turns out money is pretty much a universal motivator. Now Joe still had to fill a $1.8 billion black hole in the 1MDB accounts. He had managed to defer it via shady accounting, but the hole was still there. So via an extremely convoluted set of private accounts and transactions going backward and forward from multiple countries and corporations, Joe had conjured up assets of $2.3 billion, which outrageously gave 1MDB a $300 million profit on paper. None of this actually existed in reality, and you'd have to spend months, maybe years, digging through corporate records to find it. And that's if you could find it, because trust me, these things aren't easy to trace. To enable this, Joe just kept paying people more and more money than they'd ever earned. Bank getting suspicious, just give them record broker fees. And you have to remember that at this time, while there were tons of regulations created by governments, those same governments didn't enforce those regulations. The banks were mostly self-regulated until many years after the 2008 crash. By this point, the web of people that Joe was paying was so big that even he couldn't remember who they all were. These banks were all either knowingly or unknowingly roped into these schemes. Highbrow banks, reserved for the wealthiest of the wealthy. Coops, UBS, BSI, British, Swiss, Malaysian, Singaporean. But it would be their long-time American banking friend who would be the biggest and most willing culprit. Now, earlier in the story, I was a little misleading when I talked about IPIC. I referred to it as a $70 billion sovereign wealth fund, which is true. But I gave the impression that this was a wealth fund backed by state oil money. It isn't. The chairman of the fund is Sheikh Mansour, the same sheikh who now owns Manchester City Football Club. Al Mubarak, Manchester City Group's chairman, is the IPIC fund manager. Mansour has veto power and ultimate control, but the fund is largely run by Al Mubarak, who allows a guy called Kadim Al-Kubaisi to run the fund day to day, with little to no oversight really. The sheikh himself has roughly 40 billion in wealth and assets, which is largely come from oil-related business from his family. But none of that wealth is tied up in IPIC. IPIC is funded by large amounts of debt, about 19 billion or so. In fact, for a region which is supposedly one of the wealthiest on earth, they have a frightening amount of debt crises. In 2009, they had a debt crisis created by a housing bubble. In 2020, they had debt increase to 77% of GDP, thanks to a decrease in nominal GDP. And economists are saying that by 2028, they will again have another debt crisis, as they'll be due to pay 2/3 of $78 billion in debts, which they currently owe. It genuinely boggles my mind why an area so obscenely wealthy has to keep borrowing so much money. It's not like they do it for tax purposes like everyone else, because they don't have income taxes. And it's not like you could say, oh well, it's always better to spend somebody else's money. That would be true if you never had to repay the loans, but you do, and you have to repay the loans with interest, so you're actually spending more money than you would if you spent your own money. In 2011, the current ruler of UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, actually placed a restriction on debt issuance because the problem was so rampant, and said that nobody could issue debt against a state-backed company without going through central authority first, which is why IPIC wasn't backed by any state funding. And Sheikh Mansour certainly didn't want to risk his own money by pouring it into IPIC, and so its funding didn't come from states' oil profits, it came from debt raised mostly by Wall Street banks. Those banks were happy to lend the money, mostly because IPIC was still 100% state-owned, even if it wasn't state-financed. The thinking was that even if IPIC couldn't make good on its debts, the state would just bail it out, and that's exactly what happened most of the time. The Abu Dhabi government just kept saving it, and many other wealth funds like it. Wall Street also tended to view it as easy money, because at that time this area of the world was an emerging financial power who had come into that wealth relatively recently via oil reserves. They didn't come from old money where they had, generations of people managing that money. People tended to see them as less financially literate and more naive. Whether that's fair or not, I guess you'll have to decide for yourself. Anyway, what I was getting at was that IPIC looked like a cash and asset-rich wealth fund because of its ties to Abu Dhabi, when in reality, it was a debt-laden mirage. 1MDB was looking to raise money to buy a collection of coal power plants so that they could repackage them together and sell on for a profit. This would cost about $3.5 billion, but would net the fund about $5 billion, which would almost plug the hole in its balance sheet. However, they didn't have $3.5 billion to spend. In fact, I think by this point there was probably only a couple of $100 million left. So, they decided to sell $3.5 million in bonds to raise the money that they needed. But because it had never done this before, it had no credit rating, which made it unlikely that anyone would buy the bonds, especially with the rumours flying around that some of its dealings were a bit shady. So they approached the IPIC to ask them to guarantee the bond issuance. The irony, right? A wealth fund which was basically a mirage built on debt being asked to guarantee the debts of another wealth fund, which was basically a mirage built on stolen money. In return for IPIC guaranteeing the bond, they would be entitled to buy shares in the new power production entity at a much more favourable price. Sheikh Mansour said yes. If you're wondering why Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund would ask another sovereign nation to guarantee some of its debts instead of just guaranteeing them itself, you're asking the same question that a lot of Goldman's compliance department asked at the time, proving that actually there were some people who thought it was shady. But Leisner just overruled them and then brokered the deal with Mansour against those concerns. In the aftermath of 2008, when banks were fighting against restrictions on their bonuses after the bailout, they didn't see concerns. They saw a quick, easy way to make a lot of money. I remember reading at the time that banks paid back the bailout money the US government had gave them all after 2008 and wondered how the hell they did it so quickly. This is one of the ways how. They just found different ways to cheat. However, Goldman did do the required due diligence and the proposal went through 5 different committees' hands, which each expressed concern mostly about the involvement of Jho Low because they had turned him down for a private account previously. So how could they then endorse a $3.5 billion deal which involved him? Tim Leisner talked down all those concerns and repeatedly said Jho wasn't involved and he had just been a one-time advisor to the fund at the very start. As usual, this was because Jho had agreed Goldman could take $190 million as a fee. For reference, Goldman usually received $1 million for this service. Tim forced everyone to overlook all these concerns, and because Tim was bringing in money again, nobody higher up pushed back against it. About a month or so later, Jho was trying to arrange for $576 million of their newly acquired money to move to a BSI account in the British Virgin Islands connected to a company called Arbor Investments plc. BSI's compliance department were asking why such a large amount of money was going to such a small account. They were right to be suspicious because Arbor Investments had a suspiciously similar name to Arbor Investments PJS, which was an official subsidiary of IPIC. This company was another one of Jho's shell companies, designed to pay out the chairman and chief executive of the real Arbor for their involvement in the scheme. About half a year later, Goldman raised another $1.7 billion for 1MDB in bond sales, and another $780 million of that money was diverted into Jho's accounts again. After vacuuming even more money into his accounts, which was necessary really since his spending hadn't really decreased, he then gave the full green light for the Wolf of Wall Street production and wired $200 million over to Red Granite Capital, the finance arm of Red Granite Pictures. Production got going straight away, with Reza Aziz and Joy McFarlane using the money to fund the production. They also adopted Jho's habit of appropriating money and used the funds to buy properties and acquire a collection of vintage rare movie posters costing about $1 million per poster. On November 4th, Jho was celebrating his 31st birthday, and as usual he was celebrating in style. He set up a huge party in Las Vegas and had multiple world famous guests. The party was circus themed and had acrobats and an indoor Ferris wheel. He paid Alicia Keys' husband $800,000 to be DJ for the night and even had Britney Spears jump out of a giant birthday cake when it came time to sing happy birthday. After Wolf had finished filming, Jho held another huge, expensive and exclusive rap party at Marquee nightclub in New York. But even after all this, he wasn't done partying yet. He had an idea for a New Year's celebration that nobody had ever done before.
Where did you spend New Year's Eve?
Well, you know what? Oh, yeah. You're talking about like this past
This
New
is the benefits of
Year?
being
the
a
benefits,
superstar.
I got a friend, he got some money. And he flew me, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jonah Hill, and some other cats, and we flew to Australia, right? And we did the countdown in Australia. G'day, Mike. How are you, Mike? Jamie, g'day, Mike. So we did the countdown in Australia, then jumped back on a plane, and then did the countdown in Vegas. That's crazy.
The party on a plane that Fox is talking about is one thrown by Jho Low. The cat with the money that he's referring to is Jho Low. Fox and Low had been friends for about 3 years at this point. Jho paid roughly $1 million to rent a 747 airplane, and after throwing a lavish New Year's party on massive rented super yachts in Australia, Jho and his celebrity friends, which included DiCaprio, Jonah Hill, Jamie Foxx and a collection of supermodels, hopped on a plane and quickly flew to Las Vegas to a club called Lavo for another outrageously expensive New Year's Eve party. Even by Jho's standards, this was a wild night. His previous, very public party binges before brought him a lot of negative attention back home in Malaysia. Jho had learned from that mistake and asked everyone to keep his name out of the press and refused to allow anyone to take photos or videos of his insane party on a plane. But despite his slightly more cautious nature, he was blissfully unaware of the political tension which was threatening his scam over in Asia. In Malaysia, Najib was trying to get re-elected again, but it wasn't going too well. The people had begun to notice that his wife repeatedly showed up in public with new and different pieces of million-dollar jewellery, and had started protesting against corruption. The people weren't responding, and he was running out of money to buy votes with. Jho returned to Malaysia to help him. He hired the singer of Gangnam Style, Psy, to give public performances, and he paid local food businesses to give free food for weeks and purchase land for the building of low-cost housing for poor people, all in the name of Najib. But it made little difference. What made things worse was Najib's political opponent was gaining popularity and publicly asking what the 1MDB fund was even for, since in the 5 years since its creation, all it had to show was 2 oil drilling ships. He was running on a platform of saying that if the people voted for him, he would eliminate the corruption and shut down the fund. Which for obvious reasons Jho didn't want, so he and Najib went to Goldman to raise some more money again. Low set up a meeting with Tim Leisner, who was more than happy to take the meeting since last time it had made Goldman $200 million and him personally $10 million. He had hoped to do more business with 1MDB, but when he met Najib he was equal parts shocked and overjoyed to learn that he wanted to raise another $3 billion from bond sales. Wanting to get all this done before the election finished, Najib put a lot of pressure to push it through as quickly as possible. Goldman sold the bonds, earning themselves another $300 million in the process. In total, they had earned $600 million just from 3 rounds of bond sales for 1MDB. Goldman went along with it, even when one of their own compliance team pointed out how suspicious it looked that the whole $3 billion would be sent to one small private bank account with BSI, and then $1.2 billion was scheduled to move to an account in the British Virgin Islands. Are you really surprised at this point? Of that $1.2 billion, Low sent $700 million to an unmarked account controlled by Prime Minister Najib. If he had plausible deniability before, he sure as shit didn't have it now. His hands were as dirty as Low's. Low and Najib spent months running around and paying sitting politicians to publicly back Najib in the hope of flipping the election in their favour. And by the faintest of margins, it worked. Najib won re-election, but all the big spending had attracted a lot of attention. Over recent months, global governments had started to crack down on financial institutions as new regulations and regulators started to come into action following the crisis of 2008. And Jho was starting to get trouble back and forth with multiple banks delaying and questioning transactions. He realised that in the event that something went bad, which was getting more and more likely, he would need access to quick funds. And while he had plenty of assets now after buying lots of Beverly Hills, London and New York properties, and he had also spent $100 million on a minority stake in record company EMI, those assets weren't exactly liquid, and if he got caught, they could be confiscated. So over the course of a few months, he spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring various high-priced works of art. By the time he was done, he'd bought about $500 million in art. This would be his rainy day fund, and he could see the sky starting to darken. To hide these priceless works of art, he turned to another refuge of wealthy people: free ports. Now, I didn't know what the hell a free port was before looking into this video. I genuinely thought that it was just a kind of port, where ships moor up and then unload their cargo. And they are, kind of. Actually they're not. What they actually do is provide a tax-free place to store things that don't require documentation. So they're a place for people to store physical assets that they don't want to pay tax on and don't want people to know that they have. These are also areas where standard economic rules of a country or state are relaxed to supposedly increase economic activity. So you might see things like minimum wage laws, workers' rights, documentation, health and safety regulations, all lower or sometimes not existent at all than the rest of the country that tax-free zone is in. For rich people and money launderers, they are ideal. You can store all your valuables in a place which nobody can find them, and you can even go and take a look at your things, and you will never, ever, ever pay any kind of tax on things stored there. Most countries have these zones. There's some in the USA, the UK, France, Switzerland, Asia, Africa, literally everywhere. Personally, I think these things seem like hotspots for criminal activity, and I'd rather they didn't exist. And that's totally ignoring the fact that they also sound like places that are rife with worker abuse. Jho slipped all of his mobile assets into a free port in Geneva for safekeeping. Over the years, journalists had only ever reported on Jho Low's extravagant parties, which did attract attention, but the assumption was always that either Jho had inherited the money or the Middle East were footing the bill. For a while, he kept his face out of the picture so that the rumours could die down. But Jho had felt anonymous his whole life, and so he couldn't stay that way for long. When The Wolf of Wall Street premiered, Jho made an appearance on the red carpet with the other producers and DiCaprio. Suddenly, people were paying attention again. The photo of Riza Aziz caught the attention of journalist Sarah Rucastle-Brown, who kept looking at the picture and asking a very simple question. How did the stepson of a prime minister have enough money to start a movie studio? Her first piece on the subject assessed in bombastic detail this very question, and insinuated that the money might not be clean money, highlighting Jho Low as a questionable figure. Red Granite lawyers sent a letter demanding an apology and retraction, hiding behind DiCaprio and Scorsese's celebrity, claiming that two people of such upstanding nature would never be involved in something with illegal funding. Rucastle-Brown just flat out ignored it and carried on digging. The increased attention was starting to make even the people on Jho Low's payroll nervous. They had to fire their accountant's auditor, KPMG, as they refused to rubber stamp a highly inflated evaluation of assets. They moved on to Deloitte as the last of the big four international auditors to see if they would agree. Luckily, Jho found that they could be sufficiently motivated and placated via the usual method: lies and inflated fees. Deloitte had actually been sent a summary of the supposed corruption at 1MDB from a politician and opponent of Najib called Tony Pua, but they just waved it away, accepting Jho Low's explanations. In the press, news stories popped up weekly, speculating about where the money Jho Low was spending on repeated visits to Vegas had come from. Reporting in the Edge magazine challenged 1MDB to provide a list of people who controlled the shell companies, which often contained all the money. Back at 1MDB headquarters, the fund was hemorrhaging money, over $100 million a year just in interest payments, and since no money was coming into the fund, it was rapidly depleting again. The decision was made to put the power plants that 1MDB had acquired on the public stock exchange. The problem was that the people who had been involved in the deal to buy those assets had been promised that they could buy a substantial amount of those shares at under market value, greatly decreasing the amount of money that would be raised. Tim Leisner spent some time trying to convince the 1MDB board to borrow even more money to buy back those shares before IPO. So they took out a $250 million loan from Deutsche Bank to buy back those shares. And $100 million of that money found its way into an account in the British Virgin Islands. The relationship between Goldman and the 1MDB board members was starting to crumble because they were realizing that Goldman might be serving their own interests more than their clients. And it didn't help that Leisner had been running around buying million-dollar properties all over America and investing in a 170-foot yacht. The fact everyone involved with 1MDB had money, but the fund didn't, was very telling. Even though there was plenty of negative feedback coming Goldman's way, and many suspected that Tim wasn't acting very ethically, the CEO of Goldman, Lloyd Blankfein, promoted him as the head of Asia and held him up as an example of great work. While all this was happening, Rucastle Brown had continued digging, and a surprising revelation was about to present itself to her. Remember this guy? 2 years ago, he had been stiffed by the Saudis who didn't want to pay his severance, and they spent the next couple of years ruining any other opportunities he might have had by spreading negative rumours about him. What the Saudis and Joe didn't know at the time was that he had gained access to the Petro-Saudi computer servers and downloaded massive amounts of internal data which detailed all of the scams that Joe had pulled off with the Saudis and showed how. Now, he was handing it over to Rucastle Brown. See, I wasn't kidding when I said that not paying him that severance was one of the worst mistakes they could have ever made. Xavier was just looking to recoup his expenses still, and so he was using the data to achieve it. He asked Rucastle Brown for $2 million and then she could have all the information she wanted. It seems like a massive oversight on the part of Jho Low because $2 million is the money that he spent on champagne. Why not spend it on buying back the information and just being done with the problem? But for whatever reason, despite knowing about the issue eventually, he still decided that it just wasn't worth his attention. Perhaps Joe was too distracted by his latest acquisition. Joe had spent millions of dollars wooing model Miranda Kerr, buying her a crystal grand piano, jetting her around the world, and sending her a $3 million heart-shaped diamond necklace. As a result, they'd been spending a lot of time together, but keeping up appearances wasn't cheap. His new super yacht cost millions per year, just in running costs and staff salaries. So, Joe did what Joe does. He convinced Deutsche Bank to issue another loan, this time for $700 million. Despite many rejections from a variety of people, Deutsche was convinced by the fact that the loan would be guaranteed by Abu Dhabi IPIC subsidiary ABOR. Now remember, IPIC itself was mostly funded by debt and had already been used to guarantee billions in loans via other banks already. There were numerous screaming danger signs which were just ignored because Joe made sure everyone got their cut. And the first $100 million of that $700 million loan also found its way to a small private account with the name similar to the Abu Dhabi company, which was also controlled by Jho Low. This took the 1MDB debts up to a staggering $10 billion, of which Joe had personally siphoned off $4.3 billion. Joe had another problem. The current account auditors Deloitte were starting to panic about their reputation as they needed to submit accounts, but even with the myriad of different schemes, there was still a $2 billion hole to be accounted for. To create the illusion that the fund had some income, he sent some of his money, taken from the latest Deutsche loan, and sent it to the Cayman Islands, where previous accounts had said that there was $2.3 billion of investments belonging to 1MDB. He then sent that $100 million back to 1MDB accounts, making it look like the Cayman Islands had provided $100 million of profit to the fund. Once this had been completed, he secretly sent the 100 million back to the Cayman Islands again, and then back to 1MDB again. So now it looked on paper like 1MDB had received $200 million in profits from the Cayman Islands investments. Rinse and repeat until the hole had been plugged. On paper. It was a ridiculous scheme which absolutely anyone looking at the accounts for longer than it took them to read the zeros on their fee for auditing that account would have spotted immediately. Somehow Deloitte didn't, and then they filed the accounts. Some people at Deutsche Bank did become suspicious that the collateral for their latest loan, the Cayman Islands investment, didn't actually exist, but for now they couldn't prove anything. But lots of people were starting to become curious. In Malaysia, former Prime Minister was making increasing calls for 1MDB to be more transparent and accused Jho of using it as his personal piggy bank, which he was, to hide himself and dispel criticism. Jho did what a lot of wealthy people do. He used a charity shield. I don't know if this term exists already, or if there's a similar version of saying the same thing in existence, but a charity shield is what I call it when billionaires try to pretend that they're really awesome people by donating to charity, and then people can see how generous and caring they are. Wealthy people absolutely love charity because it's beneficial on all angles for them. Their donation becomes tax deductible, it's great PR, and it's optional. It is one of the best and most effective ways to make people believe you're super nice when actually you're a monster. Just ask Jimmy Savile or Jeffrey Epstein. Both were huge charity donators. Over the years, Elon Musk donated $7 billion worth of Tesla stock to a charity whose sole beneficiary was himself. And he did that to avoid paying $2 billion in taxes. Zuckerberg did the exact same thing, and so did Bill Gates, and I imagine many more. So even when they're not whitewashing criminal behavior, they're still not really donating to any cause except themselves. The only billionaire who deserves any credit for giving is this guy, Chuck Feeney, who literally gave away all $6 billion of his wealth in secret while living in a one-bedroom house in Ireland. He didn't even own a car, he took the bus, and he flew coach when he had to fly. Anyway, Jho pledged millions of dollars to various charitable causes. The most laughable being a charity to clean up the oceans. The dude who cruises around in a $100 million super yacht was pledging to save the oceans. So you can see what I mean when I say charity shield. In Jho's case, it was especially performative since most of these charities never received a single penny of the money that was pledged. But it didn't stop him from building a public image around it. Jho tried desperately to rehabilitate his public image, but it was slowly unravelling as people started asking more and more questions. Sarah Rucastle-Brown had been writing on her blog, The Sarawak Report, that she had acquired inside emails which detailed the fraud on the scale of which had never been seen. The noise from political opponents claiming the fraudulent use of taxpayer money, combined with the reporting from publications like The Sarawak Report and The Edge, had started to make banks very, very nervous. One of the banks they used in Australia, in which all of Prime Minister Najib's siphoned campaign funds sat, started refusing to accept transactions and pushed to close all of his accounts. The bank had recently had a change of leadership, and the new guy had immediately seen a bunch of shady business and decided to clamp down. In Malaysia, protests had started to break out regarding government corruption. Jho started to get nervous as well, and he and Najib agreed that it was probably best that they start covering their tracks. So they ordered all the paperwork and data to be destroyed, leaving no records of anything at all. A digital scorched earth. How would they explain 6 years of records suddenly disappearing? Easy, they would just say that Xavier Justo and Rucastle-Brown hacked into their servers and destroyed all the records. And that was bold, even by their standards. Bits and pieces of stories here and there in American publications like the New York Times gave fleeting glimpses at what was going on, but so far, nobody had published a full story, because if there's anything that you've learned from the runtime on this video, it's that this story is insanely complex and convoluted. Verifying details took time. But in February of 2015, Rucastle published a story titled Heist of the Century, which told in detail how Jho Low had been siphoning money out of the fund since 2009. She detailed the large number of people who had been helping it. She printed documents, emails, agreements. She named and shamed any and everyone that she could. It was utterly devastating. Najib told Jho to leave the country and keep a low profile, while he publicly denied any wrongdoing and ordered an official government investigation into the issue. Najib's opponents wanted him to resign, and the public largely agreed with them. In the days shortly after the Sarawak report published their expose, Malaysian anti-corruption teams raided the bank at which Najib held secret accounts and forced the banker who had kept them secret to hand over pretty much everything she owned. Najib couldn't do anything to prevent it since he had to give the appearance of being in favour of the investigation. His only saving grace could be if Jho had hidden the transactions well enough that he couldn't be connected to the money. As it turns out, Justo wasn't the only person feeding Claire Rucastle-Brown information. A man who worked for IPIC's managing director Kadim Al-Kubaisi had also been aggrieved when he'd seen his boss prospering from stolen money and reneged on an agreement to cut him in. As a result, the employee had also been stealing documents which showed a number of damaging things. Now it's worth remembering that Al-Kubaisi was a right-hand man to Sheikh Mansour, so whatever damaged him also damaged the Sheikh. This treasure trove didn't just include business dealings, it also showed Al-Kubaisi behaving in a very non-Muslim fashion, cavorting with naked models and drinking. Rucastle didn't have the full treasure chest, but she'd been fed a small amount of information in a bid to encourage Al-Kubaisi to pay the employee some hush money. Perhaps realizing how perilous the situation was, Al-Kubaisi arranged the transfer of $30 million to the employee, who then burned the remainder of the stolen files. But it did push Rucastle-Brown in the right direction. Over the coming months, Al-Kubaisi would be removed in all official capacity from IPIC, and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi began an investigation into the rampant rumours of corruption. Al-Kubaisi and the people connected with him would fade from public view, which was a boon to Jho because it meant one less person to have to convince or coerce. He flew to Abu Dhabi to try and pin all the shady dealings with IPIC on Al-Kubaisi and his right-hand man. It was their names on all the documents, since Jho never put his name on anything, so it was an easier sell. He also asked his Dubai-based friends if they'd be willing to finance the purchase of a Barbados-based bank so that he could park his money there, and then it wouldn't be able to be confiscated by anyone. After realising Abu Dhabi was on the hook for $3.5 billion of bond guarantees to 1MDB, they declined to enter the deal to buy the bank with Jho. Instead, Jho asked Leisner to write a letter of recommendation for him to another private bank in Luxembourg. That letter would eventually be used against Leisner. Things were quickly unravelling. Almost everyone who loaned money to 1MDB was asking for it back. Jho was being hunted by the police for questioning, and the walls were closing in on Najib's time in office, likely ending in a jail term for corruption. He had only one option. Xavier Justo, the whistleblower who had leaked the documents to Rucastle, had found himself arrested in his home in Thailand one morning. He was detained without counsel or food until he signed a 20-page confession letter detailing how he had stolen the documents and sold them to Rucastle-Brown, who had then admitted to him that she was going to doctor all of the items to implicate the Prime Minister in the fraud. The confession made no mention of Jho Low anywhere. Najib then had Rucastle and Ho Kay Tat, the owner of The Edge magazine, detained under anti-terrorist laws while he spun the story using a state-owned newspaper of how these journalists sought to frame him. Once he got his narrative out there smearing the journalists, he released them from jail. Ho's first publication after being released was to have a note printed on the cover page of The Edge stating that they had never tampered with documents. As a wealthy and independent individual with a good public image, his statement carried more weight than the Prime Minister's. But without proving the Prime Minister had stolen anything, even his word wouldn't be enough to sway people. Najib had threatened The Edge with the revocation of its publication license if they printed anything else without hard evidence, which kept things quiet for a short while, until the Wall Street Journal ran their own piece. Using information from Rucastle Brown and some other people involved, the journal, using a very complicated series of flowcharts, showed how Najib had received money from 1MDB fund. The Malaysia Attorney General told the Chief of Police to prepare a charge sheet in advance of an arrest warrant for Najib over these allegations. Fortunately for Najib, the Chief of Police was one of his cronies and informed him of the pending arrest. A few days later, as everyone was expecting Najib to be arrested, the Attorney General turned up for work in the morning to find himself barred from entering the building. He had been fired overnight by Najib. They confiscated all of his files, and unfortunately, a small fire had broken out, which just so happened to burn all of the records incriminating Najib. Najib then fired anyone else who attempted to investigate him and suspended the Edge's publication license, rendering it unable to print any further stories about him. He had now become a full-blown authoritarian dictator. While he had silenced his critics, it had the opposite effect on the Malaysian people who took to the streets in protest. People saw the suspension of the Edge's printing license as an attempt to keep the truth hidden. To combat the problem, Najib sent anti-protesters into the crowds. These red-shirted protesters had been paid to start violence with the peaceful protesters in the hope of scaring them into breaking up. Kevin Moraes was a prosecutor for the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission. It was his office that had originally been charged with bringing in Najib before the AG had been fired and they'd all been reassigned. The problem was that when the arrest warrant had been drafted, someone in his office had leaked it to Sarah Rucastle Brown, and she'd printed it on her blog before the arrest had actually taken place. In retaliation, Najib began a witch hunt in the office and issued a notice to Interpol that Claire Rucastle Brown was now wanted for arrest in Malaysia. She lived in the UK anyway, and Interpol had also declined to assist the new authoritarian Malaysian dictator. Kevin was not so lucky. Whether guilty or not, he would suffer the consequences as he didn't turn up for work one day. Concerned family reported him missing, and a few days later, his car was located, abandoned and burnt out. A few days after this, they would find his body, strangled to death and then stuffed inside an oil drum and filled with concrete. At the time, the prosecutor was investigating an army pathologist in an unrelated corruption case. The police arrested the pathologist with Najib and his men pinning the death on the pathologist. The death sent shockwaves through the Anti-Corruption Commission, and suddenly, all investigating into Najib ground to a complete halt. Somewhere, sitting in the harbour at Seoul, Korea, was a giant super yacht. It was Jho's yacht. And rather than keeping a low profile, he was throwing a big celebrity party to celebrate his 34th birthday. It was the usual extravagant Jho Low affair, lots of champagne, celebrity friends like Jamie Foxx, Alicia Keys and her husband, and a few others. But one name was curiously missing: DiCaprio. Leo had slowly been distancing himself over the last year, and had even declined to appear in Red Granite's next movie, which was a remake of the movie Papillon, no matter how much they offered him. Sources close to DiCaprio said that he had only recently discovered the true history of Jho Low, and no longer wanted any part in his business dealings, something which probably hurt Jho Low's pride. With authorities confiscating more and more of his accounts and shell companies, Joe's funds were dwindling. But he remembered that he had put away hundreds of millions of dollars worth of priceless art as a rainy day fund in a free port. And it was raining now. He ordered an auctioneer to sell it all and accepted prices millions of dollars lower than what he paid for them. He then hopped back on his boat and started to think about his options. He couldn't go back to any countries which were friends of the USA because they'd just extradite him. So he decided to head to a place where the USA had no influence. In point of fact, they were an economic and ideological opponent of the USA. He set course for China. Najib had been trying to explain that all of the transactions flowing into his accounts as gifts from his friends in Abu Dhabi, but thanks to the fact that 1MDB had left IPIC holding the bag on $3.5 billion worth of bonds, Al-Mubarak and Sheikh Mansour were refusing to confirm the story. Najib had figured that if he could get their money back, perhaps it would strengthen those ties again and they might uphold his story. Zhou had been busy in China befriending the chairman of a Chinese state-owned land developer and convinced them to buy the power plant portfolio for about $4 billion. The Chinese state had thought it would be a good opportunity to gain influence in Malaysia and push out Obama and America's influence at the same time. The $4 billion was nowhere near enough to cover the debts the fund had accrued now, which stood at $14 billion. But it would be enough to refund Sheikh Mansour and smooth over the relationship. The government investigation, which Najib had initiated into himself, was finally complete, and people waited with bated breath to find out what it would reveal. Unluckily for them, Najib officially categorized it as a state secret, and so it never saw the light of day again. The US Attorney General, with the help of Bill McMurray's FBI investigation and some brave souls from the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, who had been helping in secret to avoid getting caught by Najib, eventually seized $1 billion in assets in a case which was amusingly filed as the USA versus the Wolf of Wall Street. They seized all of Zhou and Najib's US-based properties, a private jet, his stake in EMI. They even seized the profits from the Wolf of the Wall Street movie. It was one of the biggest fraud cases in US history. The case named Jho Low for the very first time officially, and it also named all of Zhou's co-conspirators and even Najib himself. Goldman Sachs, seeking to limit their exposure, launched an internal investigation. Tim Leissner was fired as a result of that investigation, with Goldman stating that they stood by their work and admitted no wrongdoing apart from the actions of one rogue banker acting independently. Singapore banned Leissner from working in finance for 10 years, and Leissner eventually pled guilty to stealing $200 million from 1MDB, after the FBI acquired a letter of recommendation from Leissner to a bank in Luxembourg detailing his relationship with Jho Low. Thanks to that recommendation letter not being authorized by Goldman, they were able to claim ignorance, though they did later pay a couple of $1 billion in compensation to the Malaysian government as, sort of a sorry, our dude did this to you. DiCaprio and Miranda Kerr voluntarily gave up all the gifts that they'd received over the years from Jho Low. For Leo, it was a few paintings worth about $30 million in total, and for Miranda, it was mostly jewelry valued in the millions. In Singapore, the authorities seized around $170 million worth of assets belonging to Jho Low, and jailed some of the low-level bankers at BSI who had helped him pull off the scheme. They fined a collection of private banks who had assisted the money laundering for a total of $20 million. A genuine drop in the ocean for an investment bank. IPIC never received their $3.5 billion back as 1MDB defaulted. To avoid further embarrassment to Sheikh Mansour and to make the story go away, they just accepted that they were never going to get paid by 1MDB, and IPIC was then absorbed by another wealth fund, Mubadala. Prime Minister Najib closed down the 1MDB fund. Auditors said that it owed more than $7.5 billion at the time when it was removed from public view. In 2018, he was finally voted out of office when a coalition government formed to kick him out. Najib and his wife tried to flee the country, but masses of people mobbed the airport, making it impossible for his plane to leave the airport, and he was then arrested. And Najib is currently serving a 12-year abuse of power sentence, whilst also awaiting trials for 31 other charges. As for Jho Low, nobody really sees or hears of him much anymore. After the scam became public, people learned that all those celebrities that people thought were his close friends had actually just been paid to spend time with him. Even DiCaprio and Jamie Foxx. Joe's story finishes pretty much where it started, with a solitary-looking Joe feeling alone and detached from the world, staring into a cell phone, wishing that it would ring.